This is Marcia Wilson and part 2 of my painting in progress. I'm working in Sparkill, New York at vytlacil. In part 1, you saw that I was using a large canvas size 60 inches wide by 38 inches tall that somebody had donated. So in the first section, I spent most of the time painting over somebody else's painting and getting the canvas with my image on it. After fooling around the right side up, upside down, I finally settled on a seated figure of a woman holding a dog and 3 dancing children. I'm happy with this. I was thinking about something I would like to look at in my own house because I'm 74 years old now, and I'm trying to imagine decorating my house with pictures I would like to look at. You know, when I was younger, I only hung other people's art on my walls. Art I had bought in the art shows where I participated, or art from a friend. But now, I am becoming fond of my own art. Imagine that. It took a long time for me to want to hang my own things on my wall. So, here I am painting for myself. The bold music that's playing in the background sometimes inspires me to make more bold strokes. Here I've just added a navy blue shape to the tree, but I've been looking at that tree for a week since the last time I painted, and I know the shape I want to change it to. I'm adding the blue on the figure also. My goal is to have a range of tones from the whitest white to the blackest black. So that's what I'm doing, but mostly I'm just enjoying myself. I'm working on the dog now. I'm using oil paints, not oil stick, because the painting is dry enough so that I won't have a puddle. At the end of the last session, I was using oil sticks because things were so gushy. It just, the oil paint itself got kind of lost. But once it gets dry enough, I can use paint from tubes and a brush. But towards the end of this session, you'll see I go back to paint sticks again. Paint sticks, well, I'll talk about that later, but they end up looking like pastels, even though it's oil paint in stick form. So, as I work here with the music playing, I'm getting rather pleased with this figure. The woman reminds me of my grandmother and the summer of 1948 when I had such a peaceful summer out there in 2 weeks in Clark Summit doing nothing. I realize even though this grandmother was not necessarily my favorite because her personality was perhaps the way people have described me upon occasion, full of piss and vinegar. But this grandmother had a sense of peace and tranquility about her on that summer. She didn't have money. She acted as if she was relaxed and at home and at peace with herself. What a nice image to think of, to follow. I read a letter that my grandmother had written to my mother, and she said to my mother, "The greatest gift you can give your children is the example of someone who's relaxed and at ease." So I appreciate her for that. The differences are my other grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Grandma Sandmeyer. She was more of a doer. Oh my goodness, she was busy. She made quilts and she cooked and she sewed and she cleaned. She was never idle. But she seemed a little judgmental of me, pursing her lips in a subconscious judgment when I sang a vulgar song I had learned from the children across the street, or just my unwillingness to help her with the housework. Whereas this grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Granny, who's maiden name was Gibson, but I called her Granny Hubler. Granny Hubler, she didn't seem to care what I did as long as I left her alone so that she could study her Bible in the upstairs room. So that was fine. I amused myself very nicely. And we all waited for Grandpa to come home in the middle of the afternoon so he could work in his garden. It was just a lovely time there. So here I am painting on the face. I'm using pink now. I'm not using any plan. I'm just trying to paint something I like. I just enjoy myself. And what could be better than listening to the opera while painting, huh? I think this is the Mikado that's playing, but I'm not sure. I'm not very musical at all. I'm keeping my oil paints in a plastic box that opens and closes so that they tend to stay fresh for at least a week, sometimes more, in that box. I just squeeze the tubes in there and let her rip. I have 3 paintings on the easels, even though I'm only working on 1. I keep thinking I'll have more time than I do. The time passes very peacefully and very quickly here in the studio. I'm so fortunate to have it all to myself. Someday maybe 2 or 3 people will be renting the space, and then I'll maybe try and work outside or confine myself to 1 canvas. As I said last time, my favorite artist is Bonnard. Of course, favorites change from time to time, but at the present time, I still love Pierre Bonnard, who died in 1941 at the age of 79, or maybe it was 1944, but he was a wonderful painter. He was criticized by Picasso. At one point, Picasso said something like that Bonnard couldn't make up his mind. He just makes little dabs of paint. You know, Picasso was into the bold painting that's done very quickly. And I think it was right after Bonnard died, somebody wrote an article and asked, is Bonnard a worthwhile artist? And I think he might have quoted Picasso saying, well, you know, this is a hesitant guy. But Henri Matisse wrote on the edge of the article, he wrote, I, Henri Matisse, certify that Bonnard is an artist not just for now, but for the future generations. He's a great artist, and he signed his name. And I thought that was a wonderful thing to say, and so true. I think one could argue now that Bonnard is a greater artist than Pablo Picasso. He certainly is favored by me for his humility and the fact that he never sought the limelight. He just worked quietly in France. He worked on unstretched canvas. He tacked the canvas to the wall of either his studio, which was very small, or he might rent a hotel room and tack canvases around the wall. And then when he said he didn't like to be confined by the size, so he would just paint on the raw canvas. I don't know if it was raw, it might have been primed, but he painted directly on canvas, unstretched canvas. And then when it was time to go to his dealer, he would roll up the canvas, tie it to the roof of his car, and drive to his dealer. He worked during World War II, in part, so I don't know if there was gas enough for many trips to the dealer. But he had a garden that he loved, and an overview of the town that he loved and his various houses. And he was so modest. He lived alone with his wife, Martha, who wasn't his wife until the 20s. Before that, she was his girlfriend. Only before he married her, he had an affair with a blonde woman who was so disappointed when Bonnard went back to Martha that the blonde woman drowned herself in a bathtub. Imagine that. After both women were long dead, Bonnard did a series of wonderful nudes in bathtub series. I've imitated that, only with a self-portrait of myself in the tub. It's a little different, but anyway, the whole thing about Bonnard is he uses this dot-to-dot kind of thing, but it was different from me because he drew from sketches. He painted from sketches, whereas I just paint from my head. And for that, I think about artists like Chagall, who makes up things in his head and has such freedom. He has his figures off the ground, floating in the air. I'm not at that point yet, but I hope to be. I hope to see if I can keep getting freer. Remember, Picasso's the one who said it takes a long time to become young when you paint. And there are painters like Renoir who lost his vision but kept working. He went to sculpture, I think, then. But anyway, art is one field where you can keep working as long as you can see. And I have the beginnings of cataracts, but they're not bad enough to stop me from seeing. Here I am, still working on my lovely little canvas, my big canvas, the biggest one I've ever worked on. And I'm noticing that the seated figure of the woman looks a lot like me when I was young. I know it's hard to believe now that I'm 262 pounds, that at one time I weighed 145 pounds and looked a little like this around the time of 1960 when I was pregnant with my first child, my daughter. But I don't think I have time to, but maybe I'll see if I can insert the still picture after I finish talking. And the 3 children, that makes me wonder. I had 3 children, but I had 2 girls and a boy. This looks like 2 boys and a girl, but you never know. One could be a girl. They're a little vague. I'm one of 2 sisters, and then I have a half-sister who's 20 years younger, but we never knew each other growing up. She was by my father's second wife. What greater pleasure can there be but painting by yourself in a studio with the radio going and knowing that you're worthy of this activity? When I was young, I was so filled with doubt. Was I good enough? Was I great enough? I think college might have intimidated me, being an art history major at Vassar, where we just studied work of the greats. I thought, oh dear, I wanted so much to be an artist, but I was waiting for somebody to tap me on the shoulder and say, it's time, you're ready. It wasn't until my Scrabble buddy, Ida B.B. Dreyer, told me she was an artist, and I visited her booth, well, her racks at the Village Art Show, that I saw her wonderful work and said to myself, oh my God, if I could beat B.B. at Scrabble, I bet I could join this art show. And so back in 1970, in January, I signed up for the spring art show at the cost of $15, and I went and bought an oil painting set and a painting of BB's. I spent $150 on a bouquet of flowers and a vase, and I set up her painting on one side on my left and an easel with a blank canvas on the right. I started to copy her work, but it turned into green soup. like pea soup. Bibi used to come by to play Scrabble, and she would laugh at me. And so sometime, I think January 1970, I went to the store and I bought a box of acrylics. And I did the same thing with acrylics. Now, my painting did not look at all like hers. My flowers looked like balls of colored Kleenex. But whenever I got into a mess, I would run to the shower and spray the shower on my painting, making the bathroom very dirty. But the result was quite fascinating. It was fragments of color. The best one I had, my father bought for $50 at my first art show. That was in May 1970. And my father drove by in his navy blue Cadillac. But he lived apart from me and my sister. And he bought it, and he told me to send it to my sister, Audrey, who lived in Kansas. So I did. Audrey says she wished she had the money instead. She's long since thrown away the canvas. But at the time, I was proud of it. It was my best work, and I was so thrilled that my father cared enough to buy something from me. He always encouraged me in my art. I inherited my talent from my father's side of the family. Both of my parents are half English and half Swiss, speaking in generalities. By Swiss, I mean German Swiss or Germany. So the Swiss side of my father would be his father or his grandparents. His paternal grandparents came from Switzerland. And his paternal grandmother was born Anna Straumann, and she was an artist. She just painted for a hobby, but her paintings were wonderful. I'm so lucky that I have a painting she made, a copy from a postcard by Sir Luke Fildus, and the postcard is called The Doctor. I'll see if I can insert it in this video so you can look at it. She painted that in 1934 when the Chicago World's Fair was on. My grandfather had gone there to visit the World's Fair, and on his way home he brought this postcard, and his mother said, "Could I borrow this postcard for a while?" And he said yes. And so she copied the painting on it, and it's just beautiful. Now that I do genealogy, I can understand why it moved her so much, because she had lost a child, a boy, I think named Arnold, who, as a child, the boy just before my grandfather. So she must have related to the woman in that painting who's mourning her sick child. Anyway, that was where I thought I got my talent, because my grandpa Sandmeyer, the Methodist minister, he was such an artist. He always had a pad of paper in his pocket and a pencil, and he would sketch constantly, to my delight. But I was living in Leonia here in the 1970s, probably the 80s. I guess it was the 80s. I had started my web page, and a lady emailed me from Ohio saying that she had a folk art kind of painting, a scene with cattails and a lake and a house and some people, and the signature on the back matched the story I had about my ancestors. It was signed Mary Jane Beecher Gibson, Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And the handwriting matched the handwriting of my great-grandmother, so I knew it was genuine. What a thrill. You know, I found a letter my mother had written my father in 1931, the year they got married. And it, my mother said, she said, Granny was talking to me about the painting she wants to give us for our wedding. And she actually cried when she said, "Please don't put this painting in the attic." I was so moved by that, thinking, I know how my great-grandmother must have felt. Anyway, I framed the painting I bought from that lady in Ohio, and I have it hanging alongside my staircase, right next to the painting of my other great-grandmother. And of course, neither painting will ever be in my attic. They'll have a place of honor in my home and in my heart. This is not really a how-to video because, I don't know, what's there to say about technique? I just paint. I try not to think while I'm painting. I just paint. I was in college. I went to Vassar, and I switched to art history at the end of my junior year. So I really had to cram all these classes into 3 semesters. Sometime in there, I asked the teachers, how do you know when a painting is good? And their only answer was, just keep looking. Just look. Keep looking. I thought that was a very frustrating reply, but now I understand. So when it comes to painting and when it comes to judging, just keep looking and make up your own mind. So as I said, I have my favorite artists, and I do like Bonnard, I do like Chagall, I do like a guy named Derain. What a great guy he was. He made some terrific boating scenes, and he made a wonderful portrait of Henri Matisse, and of course Matisse. What an artist. So I'm in a way stuck in those guys at the early part of the 20th century, I suppose. I tend to admire artists I knew personally. When I started painting in 1970, I purchased and made the acquaintance of a guy named Jacob Knight. He painted in a kind of acrylics in a sort of a realistic folk art tradition. And Patrick Sariski, who carved in wood. And most of all, Daniel Presley, who was a folk art wood carver, originally from South Carolina. So those were my role models, in addition to Ida B.B. Dreyer, my friend, the Scrabble-playing flower painter. But growing up in Leonia, New Jersey, I admired 3 artists. One was Lynn Ward, who's well known for his wood engravings. He lived on Christie Heights Street, maybe number 200 Christie Heights Street. And Grant Renard, who also lived on Christie Heights Street, but at the top end, and he had a studio behind his house with a potbelly stove in it and an etching press. He was a wonderful man who gave me an etching when I won a prize at an art show that he judged. And the third one was Charles Chapman, who gave me lessons when I was 13. He said I was the messiest painter he'd ever met in all of his 70-odd years of teaching. I think he said 70 years. Is that possible? It must have been 50, because he was in his 70s then, I suppose. But those were my 3 role models. Given modern artists, there are wonderful painters out there, and photographers. There's Sally Mann with her wonderful photographs. Then there's those modern painters. One of them is named Jenny. I can't remember her last name. She does these outrageous fat female nudes, fabulous pictures. And then there's that cartoony one who did the cutout kind of shapes of canvases. She was very happy. And then that polka dot artist from Japan. There's so many great artists, really worth thinking about. Even the guys who did the orange gates in Central Park, these people who think big. There's so many, they're all around us. But in my head, here I am painting away like a Victorian lady. And my grandmother, the one who was born Zelia Gibson, she was a Victorian lady. So I kind of like my schmaltzy touch. We are what we are, right? And it's lovely not to worry anymore about whether I'm good, whether I'm worthy, whether my paintings are fit to hang. No, I'm just painting for fun. I'm painting for me, and I'm painting for the joy of it all. What a lovely, lovely thing. Listening to music, having a great time, filling my memories, filling my canvas with memories, even made up memories. But the thing about getting old is I don't have the energy I had when I was young. So even though I may want to paint, it doesn't come so easily as that. I've really talked too much on this tape, and I'm afraid I've bored you. But I haven't finished the painting. So, what should I do? Well, I can tell you about one of my heroes who lived in New York City. Her name was Alice Neel, Neel. And it was about 1975 when I read a little article in the New York Post newspaper about her. And it said she lived on the corner of Broadway and 107th Street. So I drove my car over there with my 5-year-old daughter, Rebecca, in the back seat. And I got to the corner and stopped at a fire hydrant. I thought, well, they'll never tow my car away with my daughter in it. So I told Becky, just sit there. And I ran into the first building I could find to look to see if that's where she lived. The mailman was there. And sure enough, there was a mailbox with Neel printed on it. So the postman said, "Are you here for Miss Neel?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "You want to take this mail up for me?" So I said, "Sure." He said, "It's right up there on the second floor." So I grabbed this big armful of mail and trotted upstairs with it and knocked on the door that he showed me. And Alice Neel opened it. She was a short, grandmotherly-looking woman with white hair. She was a little older than I am now. She must have been about 80 at that time. Maybe younger than that. And she said, "Oh, are you the reporter from the Inquirer?" And I said, "No." She said, "You're not? I'm expecting a newspaper reporter." And I said, "Well, here's your mail, Miss Neel." And I explained that I had just driven over from New Jersey to meet her. And she said, "You've barged right in." And I said, "Yes, I had." And she said, "Well, you might as well look at my paintings while you're here." So she ushered me in and showed me some of her wonderful paintings. She was renowned for doing portraits of people. but I had to get downstairs to Becky. Anyway, I went back about 4 times to see Miss Neel. She was so gracious. You know how some people don't live up to your expectations and other people exceed them? Well, Alice Neel was the real deal, let me tell you. She was the greatest. Anyway, I brought one of my batiks one day, and I said, "Oh, Miss Neel, one of my goals would be to paint like you." She said, "And I'd like to play like Mozart." She was so cute. Anyway, another time she read my palm, told me my fortune, said I was going to have a long life. At that time, she told me she was only going to live another 5 years. And you know, she was right on. I think she died in 1985, around age 85. But she was lovely. I took her picture a few times, but I had an old-fashioned film camera with black and white film in it. And she often had people just hanging around her. She was dressed in a bathrobe and nightgown usually, and people just came to chat and pay homage, I guess. One such woman, I think, came from Washington, D.C. maybe. And when Alice was out at the bathroom or the kitchen, this lady asked, would I please take her photograph with Miss Neel? It would mean the world to her. Why, I didn't know what to say, but I said, okay. So when Alice Neel returned, I said, Miss Neel, could I take a picture of the two of you together, or the picture of you together? She said, oh, yes. And she raced over to her portrait of 2 young men that I think had been in a Rutgers show. It had been on the cover of some magazine. And she put her arm around her own painting and smiled broadly. Well, this tickled me pink. So I think I took that picture, but then I had to say, no, I mean with this woman. So with the woman, Alice didn't look so pleased, but I thought that was a cute little thing. Alice talked about how, well, anyway, I saw her at a lecture once at, I think it was the YMHA in New York City. And her granddaughter Olivia was with her. And the lecture was just wonderful. I wish I had taped it, but I didn't. At the end of the lecture, I said, Miss Neel, can I drive you home? She said, oh, I'd like that. Thank you very much. So she and her granddaughter waited at the elevator with me, and I said, you wait right here, I'll pull up my car. It was a Volkswagen, a very old Volkswagen station wagon. This would be around, again, maybe 1979, 1980. And as I pulled up my car, Alice Neel said, she opened the door and said, I'm accustomed to riding in much better cars than this. Anyway, we drove up Park Avenue, and I remember her pointing to a sculpture by Louise Nevelson and saying, oh, look, there's Louise, who I guess was a friend of hers as well as a contemporary. Alice was just a wonderful person. I bought one of her books and asked her to sign it, and she wrote, Love Alice on it. Isn't that the sweetest thing? Sometimes when I'm feeling a little blue, I think to myself, I have a book inscribed, Love Alice. You know, one time in New Jersey, she paid me a very nice compliment. It was at a show called Salute for Women in the Arts. And Alice was in that show, and I felt her work was head and shoulders above everything else on display. I waited in the library of some college, maybe it was Ramapo, and when she showed up, she remembered me, and she paid attention to me. I was working on my batik as usual. I used to sew it and make trapunto out of it, and somehow she held up a batik of an Indian and said, "Now this is art. This is real art." Wasn't that nice of her to say that in front of those other people who didn't like that? And then she pointed to somebody else in the group, I think named Madeline, and she said, "Would you make me a pillow out of this?" And I don't think that woman was pleased at all. Anyway, back to the painting here in this video. I'm working in oil sticks now. And these are the still photographs. I think we're finally coming to the end of this video. The painting is still not finished, but I'm keeping working on it, and I apologize for carrying on so long. Well, anyway, goodbye from Marcia until we get to part 3, maybe next week. Bye-bye.